Greg, yet another war. We're 3 weeks into the war in Iran. It seems a good chance to reflect in this podcast because this has all been about an air war. We've not yet seen any boots on the ground, despite the US Marines potentially getting involved. We can get into that. Um, but it is interesting that we've also not heard much about the impact on the US air assets. It almost sounds like we know Iran's been vulnerable. We know that the America's been dominating the skies, air superiority, and Trump saying we've killed everything. But it's not been without its losses, has it, by the US military?
No, it hasn't. I always try and make light of things, but this is not no joking matter. This is obviously quite a significant moment as we wait to see how this all plays out. I think what we've seen in the round is a very good tactical campaign in many respects. We're talking about an awful lot of aircraft, weapons, and targets. And obviously, we hear about the bad things that happen. I suspect that America and Israel have hit a high degree of the targets they were hoping to hit. But that doesn't mean you win the war. And of course, what we have also seen, which we're not used to, let's be honest, in this world of huge dominance of air power from the likes of America, is we have seen some notable failures. I'm sure we'll get into those in a minute. So, and unfortunately, in this day and age, you tend to get measured more on your failures than your many successes. So, yeah, I think there has been some moments here that have caused America to have a rethink. And if you look at their disposition now, a lot of their assets are no longer forward deployed. A lot of them are quite back towards the rear.
It's been pretty clear that Iran is not the sort of paper tiger. It's been able to strike back, and I think what I want to get into, I think here is that we've been talking about control of the air. It's been so vital, and actually there's been some really significant issues for the UK this last week. We'll get into that later. But if the US is struggling at times to do this without loss, I think there's been 16 US aircraft lost to my knowledge so far to the start of the war. 10 of those were MQ-9 Reapers, which you and I have operated around those. They're not, they are inevitably vulnerable. We understand 9 of them were taken out in flight. One was taken out on an attack on the Jordanian airbase. But I think the first one I'd like to get into of the sort of fratricide is that 3 F-15 shot down by the Kuwaitis on the 3rd of March. Um, because there was a lot of confusion around that. Inevitably, people didn't want to talk about it. But 3 US aircraft being shot down by the Kuwaitis. Originally, it looked like it was ground fire. Then it looks like that a single Hornet, F-18 Hornet, was involved. What was your take on that episode?
Yeah, I mean, it was almost unbelievable. I mean, it's not unbelievable that you have fratricide when you've got a lot of aeroplanes in the air. That was very early days as well, if you remember. You've got a lot of Gulf countries that may not have been brought into the fold in the planning phase, and therefore you're having to make things up on the fly and integrate all the different assets into what's known as a recognized air picture, so that everybody knows who the good guys and who the bad guys are. And perversely, there aren't many bad guys around. We weren't going to see an awful lot of Iranian Air Force activity. So 99.9 times out of 100, if you were seeing an aeroplane, you could almost assume it was going to be a friendly. And yet, a Q-80 F-18 saw the opportunity of all opportunities with 3 F-15Es in front of him and shot all 3 down. Very embarrassing for the F-15Es, very embarrassing for Q-8 and the pilot concerned, but also a failure of air control in the fullest sense, because somebody was allowed to prosecute an attack against 3 friendly aircraft.
Well, I'd really like to get into that because, what sort of weapons might likely were involved. We do now understand that the attack happened during a period of intense Iranian drone attacks. So there were lots of targets effectively coming in. Understandably, the Kuwaiti pilot would have been trying to defend his homeland. And we understand actually one of the attacks did result in the death of an American on the ground. So it was a pretty intensive, complicated picture. But as you say, first of all, I'm sort of looking at the airspace. From my time out there, the Kuwaiti airspace is not big, so you have to be looking beyond that, and your situational awareness may not be all it is. But let's look first of all at the weapons, because if you were using conventional air-to-air weapons with a radar, your adversary or your target would know that it's being targeted. In this case, it feels like the US aircraft were almost shot from the sky without really knowing what was going on. Therefore, it feels like it was probably infrared missiles. What's your take on that?
Yeah, that may well be the case. I mean, I think what's everyone, you're absolutely right to bring up the fact there was probably a bit of chaos going on, and therefore nobody really quite knows what's happening. Did the F-18 pilot think these were three Shahed drones? They need to brush up on their recce, perhaps. But if you're flying over friendly territory, you should also be squawking your friendly IFF codes. One imagines that all the aircraft were coordinated, but here's the real challenge. If you start a campaign as they did, America and Israel would have been well coordinated. How well coordinated were the other nations' air forces in the air tasking order? Were they all operating to the same IFF codes, the same frequencies, to the same procedures? But you'd have expected the F-15s to be squawking peacetime friendly codes. And therefore, the aircraft identifying it, or even the radar on the ground that might have identified it, because there is a radar on the ground in Kuwait that you'd imagined would have been coordinating any activity. So yeah, there's quite a number of things here that went wrong, and then to be fired at and then not react, and it does appear there was not an awful lot of reaction. So either this F-18 got very close and fired, as you say, IR missiles, or the F-15 saw the F-18 and ignored it because they knew it was a friendly Kuwaiti F-18. In fact, they had total situational awareness until the point where somebody pulled the trigger. So yeah, there's an awful lot of detail to come out of this. But yeah, it's almost unbelievable that three aircraft could be shot down in such a short space of time.
Yeah, so on the assumption that maybe the American aircraft, were shot down by infrared missiles, so you don't get any really warning apart from your mate exploding. Part of this is sort of going, okay, to date, I mean, it was early in the war, but it was still expected that the Iranian Air Force would be shot down on the ground rather than in the air. And as you say, it does appear from some of the videos out that they were certainly able to see each other. So how much of this is also down to the inexperience of the Q80 pilots? Because we both operated in the coalition. They operate some amazing aircraft. They do a fantastic job of getting their training up to a certain level. But you and I are both veterans of Red Flag. And I don't know about you, but that big exercise, 100 aircraft against Red Air, your head explodes with the complexity of all day one. By the time you get to day 14, you're kicking some butt in the skies. To my knowledge, Q8 doesn't do that sort of exercise. It's a very different airspace. And therefore, how much of this do you think is just down to a relative lack of experience? And therefore, one of the challenges of conducting these sorts of war with lots of different international partners.
Yeah, I mean, that's bound to be a factor in this. I mean, I've operated out of Ali Al Slim and Q8 many a time. And I've done some training with the Q80 Air Force, even with their F-18s, actually. But it's very limited tactical training. They're not used to these large packages or the level of control required, and understanding of the bigger picture, integrating yourself into an air tasking order, all the mode 4 squawks and all the other things that you have to do in those types of scenarios. So yeah, they would have been very focused on defending Kuwait, which, as you say, I mean, you can fly across Kuwait in 10 minutes, roughly. So it's a very small piece of airspace, and they're nestled up in that corner, right up against Iranian border. So they would have been on high alert, but they would have been used to a tactical scenario. And how they ended up stuck behind these three F-15s and then pulling the trigger is still flabbergasting. But yeah, I think if you've not been exposed to those bigger scenarios, you don't perhaps ask yourself the same questions before you pull the trigger that you might, because actually common sense would have told you that those were far more likely to be friendly. It is somewhat surreal, though, isn't it, that we had more control of the air exhibited by US and Israel over Iran than we have over friendly countries in the Gulf Coalition. So it just goes to show that air control is a 24/7, 360-degree problem. It's not just something to win over enemy territory. you also need to secure it over your own, which sometimes means making sure that everyone knows who everyone is.
But I guess that's the point that flows from it, isn't it? I mean, in the Gulf War, I know our boys were more concerned about the American system shooting you back down as you headed back to Kuwait than they were about the Iraqi air defense systems. It's not because America is bad; it's just it's incredibly difficult to coordinate. How much of this do you think was based on the fact that you had the U.S. carriers launching some of this stuff, and therefore how much more difficult it is to coordinate with the Al-Udeid and the sort of airspace control? How much do you think that was a factor?
Yeah, I mean, it shouldn't have been. I mean, they're pretty well practiced procedures now with the KAOX and the integration of carrier-based aircraft into the air tasking order. They should all be operating to the same procedures, same code, same squawk, same frequencies. What for me, I think it's more about how much of that was communicated to the Kuwaitis. So if you're a young Kuwaiti F-18 pilot getting up on day two, whenever it was, of the war, wondering what the hell is going on, how well were you read into the broader air tasking order? But it would have added to the mix because we're talking about a lot of airplanes. And of course, through Kuwait will be flowing probably quite a lot of the Israeli traffic as well. So you know, I haven't pinpointed the exact routes that they were flying, but Kuwait would have been quite close to the center of all of this, and being so close to Iran would have been very alive to the threat that may be posed. You raise a really good point, by the way, about the previous threats. So when I first heard this incident, my mind went back to that Patriot shoot down of an RAF Tornado, literally coming out of Ali Al Salim. And interestingly, that was exactly a similar scenario where the Patriot battery was under attack, or it thought it was. It turned out it was an insider threat. And all hell was breaking loose, and they just did the wrong thing. And it's very easily done, unfortunately, which is why procedures have to be followed.
No, I was only asking only because I mean it was back in the day, but having operated off what were then Her Majesty's aircraft carriers, Invincible Illustrious and Art Royal, the comms wasn't as good as it was at Al Udeid. You know, you didn't have the same briefing facilities, you didn't have the same intelligence. Yes, you should have done, but it was inevitably more difficult to be plumbed into some of that. I'm sure it's very different on the US carriers, but I just wondered how difficult that was to
Yeah,
maintain.
you're right to bring that up. And I mean, I think it has got better, but you're right. The comms links have never been as good um, out to the ships. I remember we used to fly the ATO out in a hard copy to the carrier because it was the only safe way to get all the messaging across. Because for anyone who's never seen an air tasking order, we're talking hundreds of pages here every 24 hours. And somewhere in there is your mission and your procedures. It's quite a document. It's easy to electronically search, but when you're doing it through a paper one, it's a real pain. I mean, things have got a little bit better with Satcom these days, but yeah, it's an issue. And once you're in the air, of course, you're then expecting all the data links to work and everyone to be on the same data link network and everyone to be talking to each other. Well, was the F-18 on the same data link as the F-15Es? I doubt it, based on what happened. So yeah, all sorts of issues here.
So that was one of the sort of unfortunate incidents. One of the aircraft that we have now deployed, okay, admittedly not attacking Iran, but into the region is the F-35, um, known for its stealth characteristics. What do you make of the story that I think it was March the 19th? The pilot of an F-35 suffered shrapnel wounds
Yeah.
because he was damaged during a combat mission. You know, I'm just going to read out a statement here. US Central Command has not provided details, but the aircraft did look likely damaged by a surface-to-air missile, surface-to-air missile rather than by small arms fire or another projectile. What's your take on that?
Yeah, lots of rumors flooding around, including video footage allegedly of it being intercepted, and then rumors about search and rescue missions looking for the wreckage. But actually, CENTCOM have reported it heavily landed somewhere. You could argue that's a crash, but you know the pilot clearly alive, but hurt. And the reason, by the way, for those that don't know, an air-to-air missile typically uses a fragmentation warhead. So the missile doesn't hit the aircraft; it gets very, very close, and then this fragmentation warhead effectively expands. And sometimes it either uses pellets or it literally uses an expanding rod of metal, which is why the pilot would have been injured in the way that they've described. So an F-35 is stealthy. It's very hard to see on radar. We know all the stats about size of a hummingbird or a tennis ball or whatever it is. so it is hard to detect on radar, but they're not invisible. Even if they're at 30,000 feet, you can see them. If they start sending out contrails, you obviously see those. So you're very careful to avoid the level that contrails form. You have a heat signature, you have a noise signature. There are lots of ways of queuing a system onto the aircraft, and especially if it's on a decent weather day. And that might then allow you to IR track, infrared track, and then effectively passively guide a missile onto the aircraft, which sounds like what's happened here, and certainly is backed up by the video. So the pilot might not have had much warning. They should have a missile approach warner that detects a missile coming at them. So they should have had some notice. But you're in an F-35 at 30 something thousand feet on day, whatever that would have been, 20 of the war. You might get a bit blasé, and maybe you're not paying attention. If you're operating as a singleton and you haven't got a mate 4 or 5 miles off to the side looking under your belly, you might fall for this. Or your missile approach warner's not working, you didn't realize. So yeah, you can see
If
how
they
you can
even
be sneak. Go on.
Yeah, even if the mission approach warner though was working, I don't know about you, but they don't give you much warning. Most infrared missiles are fired relatively close. Even if the jet was up at 30,000 feet, what you're still talking, it's only 5 miles. These things
Yeah,
generally travel at supersonic speeds to their target. So it's seconds, not minutes of flight time. Most of the defensive aids, well, they have a mixture of, don't they, of all sorts of ways of detecting. But most of those, particularly for infrared missiles, are not going to detect something until relatively close. And there's always been a bit of banter that it gives you enough warning to know you're going to have to eject.
yeah,
And it did look, although it's very difficult to know whether these videos are true these days or not, as if a few flares potentially came out the back of the aircraft before it struck. And as you say, I just wonder. First of all, it might. I was a requirements manager on the blasted F-35. It is not completely stealthy, as you say. It is detectable. You can certainly see it, and for an infrared missile that you can lay visually and then get it to acquire a bit closer to the aircraft, it's going to have an infrared signature as well, particularly
yeah,
when you're operating in a cold sky or whatever. But I do think Iran's tried to make a big thing of this, and if it had been shot down, that first of all, what would happen if a pilot got seized over Iran?
yeah, yeah.
I hate to think what would happen to them.
Yeah, well, they're probably paraded on TV and used as a bit of a political leverage as we normally expect. Yeah, it's. I mean, we don't yet know what the missile is. I mean, America may have a better idea if it's managed to recover some of the debris inside the downed F-35, which sounds like might be a bit of a mess. So we might not be seeing that one coming back. But don't underestimate how much Russia and China will be paying a close interest in this, if indeed haven't even helped out along the way. Because to have an F-35 shot at is a bit of a wake up call. It's a wake up call that we're not invisible, that you can still be under threat. So yeah, there's a lot of questions here that until we find out all the answers, we're not going to know. But you're right to raise the point about the missile. So when a missile is fired, initially you'll see a plume of the rocket and sometimes even smoke on the older systems. Once that burns out and it's going Mach 4 or 5, you ain't going to see it. It might be maybe a meter and a half, 2 meters long, 6 inches, 8 inches wide with no plume. Good luck detecting that visually.
No. So if we move on then to so those were the targeting ones. Let's move to one of the more tragic ones, where the loss of life, the KC-135, the US tanker refueling aircraft, apparently tanking over Iraq, I think at the time. All 6 members of the crew, inevitably, there's no escape system on the 135s. But we also understand there were 2 aircraft involved. Initially, Iran was claiming we've shot it down. We've got some pictures of the other aircraft involved, another KC-135. Now, you and I have done a fair bit of tanking in our time, and it is a bit of sport. It's a bit jousting, but you very rarely get anywhere really close to the mothership. It's more you get the basket. Obviously, we do probe and drogue. The basket smashing the canopy and bashing around the aircraft a bit. What's your take? What do you think is the most likely cause of that accident, that tragic accident?
Yeah, so stepping back from it a little bit, so the tankers, I think you're right, were operating over Iraq. They tend to operate sort of up and down the Saudi-Iraq border or slightly inside Iraq. And for those of you, we've flown many hours over there, but that's a pretty barren desert area. You don't see people there. You certainly don't see surface-to-air systems. It would have been considered a relatively safe part of the world to tank in. I think there are concerns about some of the activity going on in Iraq, but the idea that someone could get a sort of medium range, medium altitude SAM system operating there. So they probably thought they were safe. They'd still have been concerned about potential Iranian aircraft coming across, but largely speaking, would have been safe. When you've got so much tanking occurring, because there would have been a lot of aeroplanes flying through those tankers from Israel, both Israeli and the US, to get gas to be able to go into Iran and out. So you tend to have tankers operating in cells. And what that means is you've literally got 4 or 5 in a line, in an orbit, staggered, normally about 1,000 feet apart. And then the aircraft getting the gas slide in between those 1,000 foot levels, get their gas and depart. So these tankers just go round and round for hours on end. And once they're set into their racetracks, normally everything's pretty safe. There are occasions when refuelers get close to a tanker, they screw up, they get the overtake wrong, or they get what's known as a pilot-induced oscillation when they're chasing the basket. And there are some pretty good footage of that on various social media sites. And initially, I thought, oh, this could have been one tanker tanking off another tanker. That does happen. And because the Americans use the boom system primarily, those are primarily using, and that means you get very close to the other aircraft with the boom to be stuck in your nose there. But it very quickly became apparent that probably wasn't the case because of that photograph of the one that got back on the ground with half its fin missing. Now, from what I've heard, is that these aircraft may well have not been squawking. So although they would be flying in their allotted altitude, they wouldn't necessarily all have been showing on radar. So I don't know, therefore, what SA each tanker had of each other than just seeing the lights and knowing what the plan was. And that what might have happened is that 2 have actually hit mid-air that weren't involved with each other, which means one of them is in the wrong place, or both of them are in the wrong place. And, if that was a head-on crash, you can see why that would very cleanly take the fin off one and why the damage to the other would be catastrophic, particularly if it hit the cockpit, obviously. So, yeah, this sounds like a straight up mid-air at high speed rather than a tanking incident, which explains why it took them quite a long time to find the wreckage of the crashed aircraft, because it was obviously spread over a fairly wide area. Whereas if it had just been a tanking incident, you expect the airplane to crash intact. And that doesn't sound like it's happened. And all the crew, I think it was 6 on board, perished.
Yeah, I think the other aircraft went back to Israel, landed at Ben Gurion Airport. But it's interesting. Apparently, it happened about 2 o'clock Eastern time, which of course is probably night time.
Yeah.
And another factor there is that you and I both have done a lot of tanking at night, but it's very difficult to judge ranges. I flew an aircraft without a radar, and you'd have an air-to-air TACAN available, gives you the ranges but not the distances. The ranges, but not the height or the like or position. And if you're operating in an environment where you are heavily reliant on your SA, which you are at night, because you've got, as you say, you've got the tanker doing a sort of racetrack pattern. You're coming along at 500 knots. It's doing 300 knots. You've got to try and work out geometrically in your head, because if you join and you go head to head, you're going to go a few miles behind it and then play catch up. Yeah. So you do a bit of geometry and then you do a bit of Hubert Fandango to try and get yourself in behind. And that's just made a lot more difficult at night. You'd imagine, I don't know if they're operating the lights off. They probably had a few lights on, but
I mean, some people could have either been lights off on night vision goggles. That's not uncommon, or lights on. I mean, this is the balance of risk. You're far more likely to have a mid-air in that part of the world than you are being engaged by an Iranian aircraft that nobody spotted. And yet we sometimes cater for the least likely risk. Actually, the greatest risk is a mid-air. So you turn all your lights on and you make sure everybody knows where everybody is. We'll have to wait and find out what the case was. But on a clear night, if you go to a tanker cell with maybe 4 tankers in it, there could be 4 chicks on each tanker. That's 16 aircraft in addition to the four. That's an awful lot of lights. You then got a nice starry night. Life starts getting quite complicated to work out who's who here. People departing, people arriving. So it's easy to see how an incident like this could happen. Now, our procedures are extremely well thought through, and it's a very much a procedural process to arrive at the tanker at the right time in the right direction, etc. But what's clearly happened here is something's gone wrong, and I can only put it down to the fact that there are so many aircraft in the airspace operating that eventually one person made a mistake, and that's what happened.
And I do wonder whether this goes back. The only time I've ever seen the bulk of the air-to-air refueling assets is when we go to war, or potentially red flag again. And even then, a lot of aircraft get airborne and just do the whole trip without refueling. So, getting it's something we sort of take for granted because it's just an airborne gas station. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
a bit of a joust to get in there. But as you say, the coordination of all these assets, making sure they're all doing the right thing, going the right way at the right time, joining and departing. When you, frankly, as a particularly the fighter guys, you've got a lot of other stuff going on in your head at the time. You've got a lot
yeah,
of other stuff coming into your ears at the time. This feels like, hey, I've just got to fill up with gas. But
yeah,
as soon as you've done that, you're focused on the big job ahead of you. And I just think it's a tragic life because with six people going in,
yeah.
we'll probably never hear, but I suspect it's an avoidable accident.
I can safely say that in all the operational missions I've done, I think I've had more moments of terror around the tanker than I have in enemy territory. It's symptomatic sometimes. I mean, I remember flying out of Brugge all the way down to Kosovo. That's a long 8.5 hour trip, tanking in shit weather. And regularly. Yeah, it was a relief to get over Serbia.
My news story, one was behind a C-130, the Hercules, a Spanish Hercules, and it kept flying in the only cloud that was there. And of course, because the drones were on the wings, every time it went through cloud, the wings bounced, so it like a whip, and the basket went like this. And you're trying to get in, and just as soon as it went into cloud, you lost sight of the basket. Then it would flash past, and then flash past again, and you went, "Oh my God, that was enough." And the only other one was, as you say, the long trawls going across the pond. And you'd plug, and then you'd have an hour and a half before your next plug. So you drift back off the tanker a bit, a mile or so back.
Yeah,
And I then woke up, and I had literally nodded off. Probably a variety of reasons, but one of them was that we used to dehydrate ourselves before we went flying because because
didn't want to use
nobody
the P bag.
you can't use the it's very difficult to use the pee bag unless you're built like an elephant. Frankly, it's just really difficult to get yourself stood on the seat and unravel everything. So you try not to. And of course, anyway, yeah, I woke up and suddenly realized that I couldn't see the tanker anymore. And I got this head-to-head TACAN that was saying I was 22 miles away. And you're going, ooh, there's ice on the right, not on the left. I'm heading the right sort of way. The head-to-head TACAN, and I'm going, the next tanker slot is about 30 minutes time. You can't go full power because you're just going to run out of gas. So you're looking, going, right, 22 miles, half an hour. I've got to have an overtake of 44 miles an hour. Let's nudge the throttle up to make sure it's ahead of me, not behind me. Sure enough, do that. And it starts to click down. You think, oh, thanks for that. And sure enough, as the slot approached, I come out the gloom, sit on the tanker
Didn't
wing.
didn't your mates notice, or are they all asleep as well?
Well, the thing is, nothing was said at the time. And it was
Someone's
only when
gone
it
off
got
on one.
Well, it's only got when we got back, and they went, "Yeah, you seem to slip a long way back," and I went, "Yeah, that wasn't entirely planned, but
Oh well. Did you have a good
yeah,
kip anyway? Do you feel refreshed?
I did." I mean, the trouble is that on the serious note, though, I mean, we used to keep a little can of orange, not can, but a squishy can of orange, about an hour to go before landing. You would chug that down to
Yeah,
rehydrate, and a Mars bar just so you get your blood sugar levels up, so you could land the bloody thing at the end of
yeah.
a sort of 9 hour trip. But yeah, it was
Oh, in a
not the
tornado,
ideal
we,
way.
we had a microwave in the back, so we were fine. We didn't really.
But anyway, mate, going back to the topic at hand. So yeah, I think there's another five of those 135s tankers were apparently damaged on the ground in
Yeah.
an Iranian strike on Saudi.
Yeah.
But I haven't heard any more. I understand they're all back flying again now. But had you heard any more about that?
Well, America's been quite coy, hasn't it, about its losses? I was reading today about how they've had to control a lot of the commercial satellite imagery to avoid bad news stories getting out. I'd heard seven, of which two weren't too badly, and the other five were. But again, and they've been flying replacements out. So I think there's probably more damage there than they'll want to admit to. But yeah, if you line 15, 20 tankers up on a pan, it's a pretty tempting target, isn't it? We all know this. And I guess what it tells us is, was America overconfident about its ability to either not be targeted because they weren't precise enough, or that the defense systems would take these missiles out before they got close? And we have learnt that nothing is 100% guaranteed.
No, and that's a great segue onto control of the air is not just about fighter jets. It's about all the support stuff, but it's also about the missile systems that protect you. And America's got world class. You know, they talk about Patriot, they talk about Aegis, and they talk about THAAD. But all of those need radar systems to make them operate. And I think one of the things that I was bantered the other day in Sky, that somebody said, why are you not reporting on the fact that American radars are being targeted and flattened in the UAE and whatever? And I went, well, I've not actually heard about it. And I've been doing a bit of research for this, and Iran's targeted the THAAD radar system. Four of them have been destroyed. Um, Two, I think, were well, it's not entirely clear. One was in Jordan, two in UAE, and one in Saudi Arabia. And I understand there's only 10 of these things globally. So they've taken out 40% of these. And when you look at another system taking out the Block 3 upgraded early warning radar, Al Udeid airbase, there's only six of those available globally. A fantastically sexy bit of kit. But
Yeah.
if you look at the Al Udeid base, and I've got a picture of it to show, um, there's a huge base, but surgically, this radar has been taken out. And I think that picture for me tells a thousand stories here. That, first of all, you know, these bits of equipment are very expensive, therefore, there's not many of them. Therefore, if you know where they are, you're going to schwack them. And
Yeah.
it doesn't look like they were particularly well hidden, or the intelligence was out there where Iran got that. But
Yeah.
Iran has been very effective at taking out the eyes of America. And that will have implications more globally, because you can't suddenly nip down to Walmart and pick some more of these up.
No, and they're definitely not hidden because they're too big. I mean, everybody knew where it was at LUD. You could see it from miles away, and you can see them from space, literally. So yeah, did they get their coordinates from commercially available means? You know, a contractor on a base with a little GPS tucked up their jumper or whatever, or were they provided data from Iran, from Russia or China? The fact of the matter is, if you've got a large static target that is a critical part of your integrated air missile defense, guess what? It's going to get targeted, and Iran have done this in a very constructive way. You know, when you're doing a counter air campaign, you go through those target sets and you slowly but surely seek to take those out to sow more chaos. And if you can do that, that then means the warning of incoming missiles decreases, which means your chance of getting a missile through goes up. So yeah, it's a very coordinated, simple campaign. And we've got to remember that in NATO, we have a nascent ballistic missile defense system that has Aegis ashore static radars that look exactly like these ones. And there's only a couple, and they will be at the top of Russia's targeting list. So yeah, it's staggering. Well, it is what it is. I think again, this comes down to America believing that they would be able to defend them because there's a Patriot battery sat right next to it. That would take care of any particular strike. And I'm not sure what actually struck these. I think there may have been drone strikes. And I think that's one of the lessons from this war, that whilst you were preparing for what you thought was the sophisticated, most dangerous threat, actually it was the less sophisticated, sneaky one that with a bit of extra countermeasures sneaked through. I've heard stories that the Ukrainians who've gone out to the Middle East to advise took one look and said, "You did what? You had static radars that were part of, you just can't believe. Why didn't you put it on wheels? Why didn't you conceal it? Why didn't you hide it? Why didn't you
That's my
move it?"
question. That was my question for you, though. If you look at, okay, those fixed ones, but some of the Patriot systems, they are mobile. There's trucks and whatever,
Yeah.
but there are sites in it. I hope I'm wrong, but it does look like they were just deployed out to the desert, and that's where they were
Uh,
operating
they're
from.
fixed. They're fixed sites. I mean, they're huge. I mean, I don't think anyone has yet come up with a way of putting it on a truck. I mean, presumably it could be done, but it would be a flipping big truck. These are enormous. You look at what we've got in the UK. It's slightly bigger, but the Fylingdales radar system, they are huge. Same reason America wants Greenland and has already got one up in Alaska. So they're critical to detecting launches from China and Russia. But they are fixed sites. They are not quite the size of a football field, but they are, you know, multiple tennis courts big. They are not small buildings.
But it goes back to that philosophy, doesn't it? That you've got to have dispersal, you've got to have redundancy, you've got to be able to move this stuff. And my last but one visit to Ukraine, when the Fencer aircraft, every day, if there was clear sky at any stage during the day, they'd re-brigade where the aircraft were parked because they know full well that
Yeah.
they'd be targeted. And I think with in the desert, where the weather traditionally is quite good, therefore the satellites will be able to pinpoint this stuff exactly. You don't need drones to find out, and therefore it isn't that difficult if you're complacent to take this stuff. Do you remember the Moskva, which was the Russian flagship that was patrolling around and around and around? And they took it out with Neptune missiles, and it should never have been able to be taken out. But because the Russians were doing a racetrack pattern and doing exactly the same pattern all day, you could predict at a certain time where that ship was going to be. So you could launch the
Yeah.
Neptune missiles at a predicted aim point and only turn the sensors on last minute. You should never be able to do that.
Yeah.
And yet, it just feels like we're going to get some lessons, I think, at the end of this that we need to have, if we're going to have effective missile defenses, they also have to be survivable.
Yeah, and it's become quite topical as well. Obviously, with the launch of those missiles towards Diego Garcia, allegedly, and the range implications of that to the UK and the rest of Europe. The fact that the UK doesn't have a meaningful air and missile defence for those types of weapons, stand fast the NATO one, and yeah, so we're going to have to learn not only about how do we defend against those systems physically, but also how do we protect critical infrastructure. Do you disperse it? Do you conceal it? Do you put it on hardened, bury it effectively, which is obviously what Iran has done over many, many years. So yeah, all of this has to be factored in, but that costs time and money. And when you're deploying into a space that America have done to conduct this war, there are only so many bases you can operate from. It's why you now see America operating from a lot further back, but that then requires more tankers, slows down the tempo of the war. So in not having control of the air, your entire tempo of your operation slows down, and that's where we are now.
The one that I just want to briefly touch on is that Iran seems to have been surgically striking a lot of American capability. They were threatening the the American carriers. You've got the Gerald Ford, the most modern aircraft carrier out in the region at the moment, and they had been provided some anti-ship missiles by China that were purpose built for taking out the American carriers. We've heard that the Gerald Ford had a major fire on board that took 30 hours to bring under control. Now, before we'd heard the toilets were blocked and reports of T-shirts, therefore,
Yeah.
was it the crew? This fire, how should we assess that this might actually have been an attack that America doesn't want to admit to,
Yeah.
or is a fire that lasts 30 hours, a credible, just an
Yeah.
accident?
Well, there's two things out of this, isn't it? I mean, I saw the photographs of it going into Suda Bay just the other day. In fact, I went there on holiday last year. Is I was looking for size holes on the side that might look Shahed drone size, or the Chinese anti-ship missile. I mean, I don't think the Americans are going to hide that. So my belief is it probably wasn't a missile strike, even if Iran will claim it. Yeah, allegedly a laundry fire. Somebody left a bit of lint in the inside. I mean, I think there is something going on that ship. It's been at sea now for 10 months. It's not a happy crew. Whether there is genuinely some sabotage going on, heaven forbid, but we wouldn't rule anything out here. But the fact of the matter is, it's a ship. It has confined spaces, a lot of electrics, a lot of fuels, a lot of material that catches fire. And it's why ships crews spend an awful lot of time doing damage control, because when things start to go wrong, they go wrong. And clearly, what's happened is that ship has sustained quite significant damage. I mean, there's talk of it taking years to fix now. That's how bad it was. And of course, once you construct a ship, it's a bit hard to get back inside it and build it from the inside out. So yeah, that's just an example of, no matter how incredibly powerful a ship might look or an airbase might look, they still have vulnerabilities, and sometimes those vulnerabilities aren't necessarily induced by the enemy. So yeah, lots
I'm
to
still
learn.
I'm still a bit concerned because 30 hours struck me. I mean, I've spent quite a lot of time on carriers, and each of the rooms has got big steel doors. There's no, they're not made out of wood. They're made out of
Yeah,
steel, which isn't
yeah,
flammable. The doors are locked so we can actually stop air and oxygen getting in. It does feel like localized fires should be relatively easy to control. Therefore, a 30-hour fire,
yeah.
as you say, maybe it is something that's innocuous and has just got out of control. But I don't believe in coincidences, and it just feels a bit strange. That's all.
No, but I think there's a wider issue here, that not only is that now clearly out of action. I mean, it doesn't look like they've taken the aircraft off, which is a weird thing. You'd think they'd take the aircraft off and employ them elsewhere. As precious as the Navy get about keeping the aircraft on the carrier. So that was quite surprising, because that air wing is now out of the game effectively. But the other carrier is also a long, long way from the action, because I think the Gerald Ford was in the Red Sea, and the other carrier, I forget which one it is now, was off
Abraham
the,
Lincoln, I think, wasn't it?
yeah,
Abraham
Lincoln, that's
Lincoln.
right, off
Yeah.
the Straits of Hormuz, is now well and truly clear of that space for obvious reasons. So yeah, and we have no military shipping inside the Gulf of Arabia. So a lot of people making a noise about whether the UK should have had ships in place. The fact of the matter is, nobody's got the confidence to put a military ship in that space because of the potential threats, and therefore a loss of a ship. And as bad as the F-35 shoot down and the KC-135 and the three F-15s, the loss of a capital ship, heaven forbid, a carrier, that is not something a nation like America absorbs easily. So yeah, we are now seeing the limitations of the ability of those to project power if they don't have enough air control, albeit of this might be sea control as well with the drone boats and other things. But yeah, staying out of harm's way.
So, an interesting segue here then. So, we are talking about the Iran war. America is using air power really alone to try to achieve its strategic objectives. It's obviously that control of the air is not just about fighter jets. It's also about training, experience, equipment, spares, weapons, electronic warfare, and the like. What we have seen, though, is despite over 3 weeks of intense bombardment, Iran is still fighting, and some of its intelligence seems to be quite smart. It does feel like there's a lot of talk about Russia being involved, because there are some reasons why Russia would want this war to extend somewhat, because it is distracting the world from the battle in Ukraine. It's also got some other benefits, hasn't it?
Yeah, it definitely has. I think you might want to factor China in on this as well, because they will be enjoying the confusion this is creating, notwithstanding the fact China's quite reliant on the oil from the Gulf. So it has got its own challenges. I mean, Russia will be now seeing its oil price go through the roof, which might be helping it. So that is an issue for them. We've even seen the Treasury in the States take sanctions off Russian oil to try and suppress the broader oil market. So yeah, Russia is benefiting in that sense. It's also seeing America use a significant proportion of its high-end weapon systems that it won't now be selling to Europe to give to Ukraine. But it's also seeing its buddy Iran, who makes its Shahi drones, going down the what's-it. So yeah, Russia is sort of seeing some positives and a fair few negatives. And there was those strikes recently in the Caspian Sea, I think by Israel, attacking Iranian shipping, potentially taking stuff up to Russia. So goodness knows what the thought process is going on there. But yeah, it's not all going Russia's way, but I think they will be seeing some benefits from this.
Yeah, but I mean, I think so. Taking up on the Shahid stuff, yes, originally they bought the Shahids from Iran, but by all accounts, they've been making their own and they've been upgrading them. So rather than the piston prop Shahed drones, they've been plugging, cheap, cheerful jet engines on the back of them. It's
Yeah.
also, I think, Russia has been pilloried for its attack on Ukraine, breaking international norms and the like. But actually, with America now going in and exactly the same, hasn't gone to the United Nations, doesn't appear to be aligning with international law. I think Russia now will feel emboldened to go, well, hang on a minute, nobody can criticize us now because the West is doing exactly the same thing. But
Yeah.
just briefly now, I've been looking because we've been ignoring the Ukraine war. President Zelensky came over, he was concerned, and actually, bizarrely, Zelensky's been offering some of his expertise and his people into the Iran conflict to help the Middle East with their drones. But what's your take on the progress of the war in Ukraine at the moment, particularly as it links to drones and the like?
Yeah, and I have been keeping an eye on that because you're right, it drops off the news radar, doesn't it, very quickly. And I was genuinely concerned that on day one when this started, I was quite fearful of what it might mean for Ukraine in terms of its own resupply and what it might do to the general, thing. I mean, Kushner and Witkoff are clearly now busy negotiating elsewhere. So, Russia-Ukraine talks have now definitely come off the table, which again might have been a concern if Russia was holding the upper hand, but that doesn't seem to be the case at the moment. So yeah, I was concerned. I'm now slightly more reassured. I think we are now seeing Ukraine's strategy of developing low-tech solutions and layered defenses is something that we all should have learned far, far quicker. And their offer to then help America. And of course, Trump suddenly realized that he couldn't ask for their help because that was going to make things rather embarrassing for him. So I think he's trying to pretend that he doesn't need their help, even though he probably does. Um, but we are seeing signs of green shoots of progress for Ukraine. They're definitely winning. I'll use that word advisedly, but they're definitely holding the upper hand on the front lines. I think we're seeing I think 6,000 Russian losses in 4 days, so 1,500 a day. That's right up there with the numbers. So the Russians might have started their spring offensive, but it's going nowhere. And now that Ukraine has got such a hold with drones, not just short range but medium range, there's now a danger that that Russia is going to Freudian slip, that Russia is going to lose that land border, that land corridor to the Crimea, not by physically taking it back, but by making it impossible to survive in it. So we're really seeing a bit of a shift here, and we're now seeing an awful lot more one-way attack drones from Ukraine. In fact, I think for the first time, we're now seeing parity. We're seeing the same number of drones coming back at Russia that Russia have been firing at Ukraine, hitting targets 1,500 kilometers away. I think it was the St. Petersburg refinery on the border there on the coastline. So yeah, Ukraine is really becoming a drone powerhouse, and it's not anymore just a nice to have. These are becoming quite significant weapons of war.
No, I'm with you. I wonder whether, the amount of weapons that have been, used in Iran war, they even if you massively increase production rates, you can't keep up with the pace that they're being used, and therefore there will be a global sort of shortage of weapons. America will prioritize itself, and therefore there'll be fewer available. It's also Trump seems to be getting very grumpy with the West, saying, how Keir Starmer's no Churchill. You go, well, actually, Trump, you're no Roosevelt either, to be brutally honest. But it might be that one of his escape strategies out of the Iran war is to blame Europe. And of course, one of the things he could do is just turn off the supply of weapons as a bit of a flippant act. Now that would cause a lot of difficulty for Ukraine, particularly because Patriots and the missile systems. I think Zelensky famously said, you're using far more in Iran than we ever use here, and yet we've got an enduring war.
I mean, the good news is Ukraine is becoming pretty much self-sufficient now. So it's stopped waiting for Patriots and Tomahawks. It's going to wait forever for those now. So let's build our own, and let's not build a carbon copy. Let's build something that works, but is a tenth or less of the price. And they appear to have a model that is really beginning to work. So actually, there's a great strength now of us becoming a strong industrial partnership with Ukraine model, and you are now beginning to see some of those agreements being signed. such that yeah, we start looking elsewhere for our high tech weaponry, and maybe the wake up call that we've now had from Mr. Trump's outbursts, I'll call them that. We were going to find it hard to wean ourselves off American tech and American weapons. But actually, what we're now beginning to witness is that the cost of ownership of American weapons isn't bearable in an attritional war. And Ukraine is offering a very attractive, cost effective model that maybe we should be looking down that route. So I think we are now, I think we were at the crossroads. I think we've gone over the crossroads now. And I think we're going to see the stars and stripes fading a little bit in the rearview mirror. And I think we're now looking at models of tech and weapon supply and rate of supply and cost of supply that are in a whole different ballpark.
So I agree with you, but the question then remains, as our last question is, but if the government wants to make defence the foundation of growth in this country, it's evident where the opportunity lies. Why aren't they getting on with it?
Yeah, and the problem there, and this is a conundrum I haven't solved in my own head yet, is if you build a stockpile of 10,000 drones tomorrow, put them in a cupboard and say, right, that's for the next war, and the next war doesn't come for 5 years. Well, those drones are 5 years old, and the technology's moved on, the capabilities moved on, the electromagnetic. So it's easy for this model to work in contact. So for Ukraine to be building 1,000 a day or whatever the number is, knowing exactly what the requirement is and adjusting it day by day for the next iteration of tactics. That's a model that will work. You're on a war footing, you're in a war, you build to order, and you just keep developing and developing. When you're in peacetime, how do you make that model work? And I think that is the conundrum that the UK hasn't got its head around. You might end up buying some and paying for the capacity to build more as and when you want them. And then it comes back to your Schneider trophy analogy. Continue to develop that in peacetime so that when you do press the button and press for 1,000 a day, you're making the most up to date, most capable. But that is a business model that's really tough to make work unless you're buying them now.
No, I get that for drones, but we are talking, and maybe it's something we'll end up looking at, is there's a lot of other. So, for example, I was chatting to somebody the other day about ballistic missile defense, and you go, it's festeringly expensive. But if you look at the strikes that Iran's ballistic missiles have been doing, so let's park nuclear. But the explosion, whilst it's very accurate, the explosion is pretty limited in terms of the damage it can do,
Yeah.
and therefore mobility, dispersal, deception. There's lots of other ways. You don't
Yeah.
necessarily need to have a multi-trillion-dollar
No, I agree.
defense system, and therefore. What is our strategy across this range of capabilities? And I think your point is, do we need the exquisite America and we can only afford one or two and then rely on America? Or do we actually think, no, there's a different way that we can develop this that's a much more cost effective, that uses British ingenuity? Some of it isn't necessarily on the shelves, but it's constantly being involved. And that's something I think it's a tragedy that we're not making some progress with, because it feels like, very unfairly potentially, it feels like the politicians are playing all this long. They're just going, oh, we haven't got any money to spend. Let's just try and survive for the next 2 or 3 years.
I think that's a very fair challenge. And I watched poor old Keir Starmer yesterday in front of the audit committee tap dancing a bit on this. Because I think governments have to project some reassurance, don't they? So at the moment, no, we can't be reached by a missile from Iran. Well, we none of us really know whether that's true or not. And quite frankly, one missile reaching the UK and landing in a field in Kent is not going to end the world. So we're not going to suddenly run up the white flag. If Ukraine had run up the white flag over one missile, blimey. So we do need to wake up here. There's a resilience issue. It's your broader point about how do we cope with this threat as opposed to try and shoot it out the sky in the Golden Dome sense. But there are things we could do differently, and we could do them now. I am hopeful. I'm always the optimist, Sean, that the defence investment plans delay, and the fact that in that delay we've learned an awful lot more lessons in Ukraine, and we've now learned even more lessons in Iran. That if that hasn't reacted to that, then we have missed a trick. And I would expect, therefore, to perhaps see more money flowing into these lower tech, more innovative solutions than we might have done 8 months ago. So this could be a positive, this delay. But boy, oh boy, let's get on with it. because otherwise we are just going to look like we are pushing it down the road. But we're seeing some signs now about capital programs. But here's the problem: when you say defence is an engine for growth, that becomes jobs at Babcock, jobs at various dry docks, jobs at BAE Systems. Well, they're not making these technologies. So we've got to be really careful here about believing in heavy industry of old and investing in that versus how do we shift into this new world? Is it joint ventures between us and Ukraine? And there are some of those. And then getting that balance right. So, yeah, this dip has got to solve a lot.
Well, you heard it first here. More money for defence. We'll see.